Innovate 2014, I tracked something that shouldn't exist. Malaysian Airlines Flight 370, it never vanished. We watched it the whole time being escorted by military fighters to somewhere we were ordered to forget. I'm a radar technician at a secret military installation in Southeast Asia. That night changed everything I thought I knew about the truth. It started at 12:01 a.m. The guy at the console next to mine called out, "Transponder dropout on Malaysian Airlines 370. Not unusual, equipment fails sometimes. But here's what nobody talks about. The civilian transponder went dark, but our military radar never lost that plane, not for 1 second. I could see it perfectly on my screen, still flying, still at 35,000 feet. To the civilian world, MH370 had just vanished. To us, it was right there. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The plane was turning west, back toward the Malay Peninsula. This wasn't a malfunction. This was controlled, deliberate. Someone was flying that plane exactly where they wanted to go. The major leaned over my console. His face showed something I'd never seen before. Recognition. He'd been expecting this. "Continue tracking," he said quietly. "Activate secure communication protocols." That meant everything we saw from this point forward was classified at the highest levels. That meant if I talked treason. For the next hour, I watched that plane execute maneuvers impossible for any emergency situation. Precise turns, calculated altitude changes, following waypoints that weren't part of any commercial corridor. Our systems tracked every move. His voice tighter now. "I'm picking up additional contacts." 2 more aircraft appeared on our screens, approaching from the northwest. My blood ran cold. They weren't broadcasting transponder codes either, but their radar signatures suggested military jets fast, maneuvering with precision. They were closing on Flight 370. He ran the signatures through our identification database. "Negative, sir. Configuration suggests fighter jets, but I can't determine nationality or origin." We all knew what that meant. Unidentified military aircraft operating without transponders in international airspace, intercepting a commercial airliner that had just gone dark. This wasn't an accident, this wasn't a malfunction, this was an operation. The 2 unknown aircraft took up positions on either side of the Malaysian flight, not threatening, not aggressive. They were escorting it. 3 aircraft flying in formation over the Indian Ocean at 1:40 a.m. and according to every civilian radar system in the region, none of them existed. That's when the intelligence officer walked into the radar room, the kind of guy who knew things that made other people uncomfortable. He didn't report to our major. He reported to people so far up the chain of command that we never even learned their names. He walked directly to the major and handed him a sealed envelope, black folder, multiple classification stamps, the kind of document that gets people disappeared if they read it without proper authorization. The major opened it, read the single page inside, and his face went completely blank. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone that means you're about to be given orders you won't like and can't refuse. "The aircraft you've been tracking is now under special operations oversight. All data from this point forward is classified, compartmentalized information. You will not discuss this observation with anyone outside this room. You will not include it in standard radar logs, and you will transfer all tracking responsibilities to the intelligence officer immediately." "Sir," I said, unable to stop myself. "For a year. 219 people on that plane. If it's in trouble, if there's some kind of hijacking situation, shouldn't we be coordinating with search and rescue?" The intelligence officer looked at me with eyes that suggested he'd seen things that would give me nightmares for the rest of my life. "The situation is being handled through appropriate channels," he said. "Your responsibility is to follow orders and maintain operational security. Is that clear?" It was clear, crystal clear. We weren't there to help. We weren't there to rescue anyone. We were there to watch, to document, and to keep our mouths shut about what we'd observed. For the next 3 hours, I tracked that plane as it flew south over the Indian Ocean. The 2 escort aircraft stayed with it the entire time, maintaining perfect formation. At one point, around 2:30 a.m., the Malaysian flight descended to a lower altitude, and the escort aircraft adjusted their positions accordingly. Everything about the operation suggested coordination, communication, purpose. At 3:15 a.m., the intelligence officer received a secure communication through his encrypted radio. He listened for maybe 30 seconds, acknowledged with a simple "understood," and then turned to address the room. "All personnel are to stop active tracking immediately. transfer all recorded data to secure storage, and then purge it from your consoles. This observation never happened. This shift was routine with no unusual aircraft activity. Everyone in this room will sign additional non-disclosure agreements before leaving this facility. Nobody asked questions. What were we supposed to ask? Where did the plane go? What was being transported that required a military escort? Why were 239 innocent people being used as cover for whatever operation this really was? The guy next to me tried. God love him. He actually tried to get answers. "Captain," he said, his voice careful but determined. "What about the families? What about the passengers? They deserve to know." "What, Sergeant?" The intelligence officer interrupted, his voice like ice. "You will follow orders. You will sign the documents, and you will never speak of this again. The families will be told what they need to be told through official channels. Your opinion on what they deserve is not relevant to operational security." I watched his face as he realized the full scope of what we were being asked to do. We weren't just keeping military secrets. We were participating in a lie that would affect hundreds of families. People who would spend years wondering what happened to their loved ones. People who would never get closure because we'd been ordered to pretend we'd never seen anything. As I transferred my radar data to the secure drives and watched the purge protocols erase every trace of that night's observations from my console, I made a choice. I saved a backup. A tiny flash drive hidden in my pocket with copies of the radar tracks, the timestamps, the escort aircraft signatures, everything. I knew it was treason. I knew I could spend the rest of my life in prison if anyone found out. But I couldn't let this disappear completely. The official story broke the next morning. Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 had lost contact with air traffic control. No distress signal, no emergency beacon. The plane had simply vanished somewhere over the South China Sea. Prayers for the families, hopes for survivors. And I sat there in my apartment watching the news coverage, knowing that everything they were saying was a lie. The plane hadn't vanished over the South China Sea. It had flown for hours after losing transponder contact. It had been escorted by unidentified military aircraft, and someone somewhere knew exactly where it had gone and what had happened to everyone on board. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part came 3 days later when I was called into a private meeting with the intelligence officer and two men I'd never seen before. They wore civilian clothes, but they carried themselves with the rigid posture of career military. Intelligence services, probably. The kind of people who make problems disappear. They didn't threaten me directly. They didn't need to. They simply laid out a folder on the table containing surveillance photographs, pictures of my apartment, my car, my girlfriend at her job at the hospital, my parents' house in the suburbs where my younger sister still lived while finishing college. These are the people whose safety depends on your continued discretion regarding the events of March 8th. "I signed the NA," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I haven't told anyone anything." "We know," the second man replied, "and we want to make sure it stays that way. Because if information about that night ever becomes public, if anyone ever traces a leak back to you, these people will experience unfortunate accidents. Your girlfriend's car might have brake failure. Your parents' house might have a gas leak. Your sister might encounter someone in a parking garage who doesn't take no for an answer. Do you understand what we're telling you?" I understood perfectly. They weren't just asking for my silence. They were holding my entire world hostage to ensure I never spoke about what I'd witnessed. For the next 6 months, I lived in a state of constant paranoia. Every time my phone rang, I expected it to be news that something had happened. Every time I saw a car following too close behind me, I wondered if this was the day they decided I was too much of a liability. The surveillance never stopped. Sometimes it was obvious, meant to remind me they were watching. Other times it was subtle enough that I could almost convince myself I was imagining things. But the real torture was watching the media coverage of the disappearance. Families crying at press conferences, begging for information, experts speculating about what might have happened, massive search operations covering thousands of square miles of ocean, looking for debris in areas where I knew the plane had never been. And through it all, I had to stay silent, had to pretend I knew nothing, had to watch innocent people suffer while protecting the truth that could have given them closure. The breaking point came 8 months after the disappearance. I was having coffee with the guy from the console next to mine at a cafe near the base. We hadn't talked about that night since it happened. We'd both been too scared. But something in his eyes told me he was struggling with the same guilt that was eating me alive. "Do you ever think about it?" he asked quietly, stirring his coffee without drinking it. "About what we saw." "Every day," I admitted. "Every single day." "I can't do this anymore," he said, and I could hear the desperation in his voice. "I can't live with this lie. Those families deserve to know the truth. Those people on that plane, they deserve to have their story told." "You can't," I said, leaning closer and dropping my voice to barely above a whisper. "You know what they'll do." "I don't care anymore," he said, and I could see he meant it. "I'd rather be dead than keep living like this, watching those families suffer while we sit on information that could help them. It's not right, it's not human." I should have talked him down, should have reminded him about the threats, the surveillance, the very real danger he'd be putting himself and everyone he cared about in if he went public. But part of me was relieved that someone else was finally saying what I'd been thinking for months. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I'm going to contact a journalist," he said. "Someone independent, someone who can protect sources. I'm going to tell them everything we saw that night, the continued tracking, the escort aircraft, the cover-up, all of it." "They'll kill you," I said flatly. "You know that, right? They're not going to let you expose this." "Probably," he agreed, "but at least I'll die knowing I tried to do the right thing. At least those families will have some answers." We finished our coffee in silence. We parted ways in the parking lot. He gripped my shoulder and said, "If anything happens to me, you'll know it wasn't an accident, and maybe that'll give you the courage to finish what I started." 2 weeks later, he died in a single-vehicle car accident on a rural road near the base. The official report said he'd been driving too fast, lost control on a curve, and crashed into a tree. No other vehicles involved, no witnesses, just a tragic accident. The road where he crashed was a straight section with perfect visibility. He was a trained pilot with reflexes honed by years of military service. He didn't lose control of his car by accident. And the timing exactly 4 days after he told me about his plan to contact a journalist was too convenient to be coincidental. I attended his funeral in a state of numb horror. His parents were there, devastated by the loss of their only son. His girlfriend of 3 years crying so hard she could barely stand. His little niece, maybe 5 years old, asking why her uncle wasn't waking up. And I stood there knowing that he'd been murdered to protect a secret that I was now carrying alone. The intelligence officer was at the funeral too. He stood in the back, watching. When our eyes met across the cemetery, he gave me the slightest nod, a reminder, a warning. My colleague had tried to speak out, and look what happened to him. Would I be smart enough to learn from his mistake? For the next 2 years, I kept my head down. I did my job. I didn't ask questions. I definitely didn't talk about March 8th, 2014. But the guilt was destroying me from the inside. I started drinking to help me sleep, to quiet the voices in my head that kept asking how I could live with myself, knowing what I knew. My relationship fell apart because I couldn't tell her what was wrong. Couldn't explain why I had become this hollow, paranoid shell of the person she'd fallen in love with. I tried therapy, but how do you explain your trauma to someone when the truth is classified? How do you process guilt over something you can never discuss? The therapist thought I had PTSD from some combat situation I couldn't talk about. She wasn't entirely wrong, I suppose. I was traumatized by war, just not the kind she was imagining. The second major incident came 3 years after the disappearance. I was scrolling through news sites when I saw a headline that made my blood run cold. Independent journalist dies in apparent suicide, was investigating MH370 conspiracy theories. The article said that a freelance investigative journalist had been found dead in her apartment from an apparent drug overdose. According to the police report, she'd been struggling with depression and had left a suicide note. But buried in the middle of the article was a detail that caught my attention. She had recently told friends she was close to breaking a major story about the disappearance of Flight 370, claiming she had evidence of a military cover-up. I felt sick. This was the journalist my colleague had probably contacted before his death. She'd been sitting on his information for 3 years, probably trying to verify it, probably looking for additional sources to corroborate his claims. And now she was dead too. Her investigation terminated along with her life. Anyone who tried to expose the truth about MH370 would be silenced permanently. It didn't matter if you were military personnel or a civilian journalist. The secret was too important, too dangerous to ever be allowed into public knowledge. But that's when I started to wonder what could be so important about a single commercial flight that governments would be willing to kill their own people to keep it secret. What was on that plane that justified not just one cover-up, but a sustained campaign of surveillance, intimidation, and murder spanning years? I started digging carefully, using the access I still had to military databases. I couldn't look up anything directly related to MH370 without triggering alerts, but I could search for other things: cargo manifests from that time period, diplomatic movements, intelligence operations in Southeast Asia during March 2014. What I found made everything so much worse. 3 days before MH370 disappeared, there had been a high-level intelligence meeting in Kuala Lumpur. Representatives from 5 countries discussing what the classified briefing notes called strategic asset transfer. The details were redacted, but the timing was suspicious. And one of the attendees at that meeting was listed as a technical consultant with security clearances that went all the way to the top. I ran his name through every database I could access without raising flags. He was a ghost, no social media presence, no public records. But I found him mentioned in 3 other classified documents, always in connection with the same phrase: special weapons transport and security. Special weapons. The kind of phrase military intelligence uses when they don't want to write out what they're really talking about. Nuclear materials, biological agents, experimental technology, the kinds of things that countries move in absolute secrecy, because if the public knew they existed, there would be panic. And this consultant had been in Kuala Lumpur 3 days before MH370 disappeared. Maybe the meeting and the flight disappearance were just coincidental. Maybe the escort aircraft were conducting a routine training exercise that just happened to coincide with the transponder failure. Maybe my colleague had really lost control of his car and the journalist really had committed suicide. But then I found the cargo manifest. It took me 6 months of careful searching through archived files, but I finally located a copy of the official cargo list for MH370. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect: electronics, clothing, personal effects being shipped to Beijing. But there was one entry that stood out: diplomatic courier package, special handling required, consignee, classified. Diplomatic courier packages aren't unusual. Countries ship classified materials all the time, but they don't usually do it on commercial flights, and they definitely don't list the consignee as classified. Normally, even in classified manifests, there's at least a department code or reference number, but this entry was scrubbed clean. No origin information, no destination department, just confirmation that something requiring special handling and maximum security classification had been loaded onto that plane. Whatever was in that package was important enough that someone had chosen a commercial flight full of innocent civilians as cover for its transport. Important enough that when something went wrong, when the operation got compromised somehow, the decision was made to escort the plane to a secret location rather than let it continue to Beijing, where the cargo might fall into the wrong hands. And every single person on that plane, all 239 passengers and crew, became collateral damage in an operation that officially never happened. I'm telling you this now because I don't have much time left. 2 weeks ago, I received a letter at my apartment, no return address, no postmark, just a single sheet of paper with a message typed in plain text. We know about the files you copied. We know about your research. You have one chance to comply, destroy everything, and forget you ever knew anything about March 8th, 2014. You have 72 hours. That was 14 days ago. I didn't comply. Instead, I'm putting together this statement, uploading copies to multiple locations online, encrypted and set to release automatically if I don't check in with the system every 24 hours. If you're reading this, it means I'm already dead or disappeared. It means the people who killed my colleague and the journalist and God knows how many others have finally come for me too. But before they do, you need to know something else. Something I discovered in the final weeks of my investigation that makes this entire situation even more horrifying than you can imagine. FT-3070 wasn't the first flight to disappear under mysterious circumstances while carrying classified cargo. Over the past 40 years, there have been at least 7 other commercial flights that vanished with similar patterns: transponder failures, military radar tracking that was never made public, massive search operations that looked in all the wrong places. And every single one of these flights was carrying diplomatic packages with the same consignee classified notation in their cargo manifests. This isn't just a cover-up of one incident, it's a systematic protocol for dealing with compromised transport operations. When a flight carrying sensitive cargo gets hijacked or intercepted or somehow compromised, there's an established procedure: escort the aircraft to a secure location, extract the cargo, and then make sure nothing and no one ever resurfaces to tell the story. The massive search operation for MH370 The one that cost hundreds of millions of dollars and covered thousands of square miles of ocean floor wasn't designed to find the plane. It was designed to convince the public that everything possible was being done while ensuring that the real crash site, wherever it actually was, would never be discovered by independent searchers. With all our satellite technology, with all our radar capabilities, with all the resources of multiple governments coordinating the search, how does a Boeing 777 just vanish without a trace? The answer is simple: it doesn't. Not unless someone with access to all that technology and all those resources wants it to vanish. Not unless the official search is deliberately looking in the wrong places while ensuring that no one else gets close to where the plane actually went down. I've spent 10 years carrying this knowledge, 10 years watching families grieve while knowing I had information that could help them, 10 years living in fear that every day might be my last, because I knew too much about things that powerful people wanted kept secret. And I've spent every one of those days asking myself the same question. At what point does following orders become complicity in murder? Because that's what this is, murder. 239 people on that plane who died, not because of mechanical failure or pilot error or even terrorism, but because they had the misfortune of being on a flight that was carrying something someone else wanted badly enough to kill for. And every person who's been part of the cover-up, everyone who's helped maintain the lie, everyone who's watched families suffer while sitting on the truth, we're all accomplices to those murders. The major retired 2 years after the incident. Last I heard, he was living in a comfortable house in the suburbs, collecting a generous military pension and never losing a night's sleep over the role he played in one of history's greatest aviation mysteries. Every intelligence officer moved up the ranks, now working directly for some 3-letter agency where his talent for keeping secrets and managing uncomfortable situations is probably considered an asset. And me, I'm the last person from that radar room who's still alive and not completely absorbed into the system that created this lie. I'm the last inconvenient witness to something that was never supposed to be witnessed, which is why I know my time is almost up. If you're watching this, if this video has been released from its encrypted storage, it means I'm gone. It means the people who've been watching me for 10 years finally decided I was too much of a liability. And it means you now carry the responsibility of deciding what to do with this information. I don't expect you to believe me. I know how this sounds: conspiracy theory, paranoid delusions, the ramblings of someone who's been obsessing over a tragedy for too long. But I've included encrypted files with this video, radar tracking data from that night, screenshots of the cargo manifest, documentation of the other disappeared flights with similar cargo notations, communications between military installations that officially never happened. You'll need someone with serious technical skills to decrypt the files, and you should assume that attempting to access them will trigger alerts with multiple intelligence agencies. But it's all there, everything I saw, everything I know, everything that got my colleague and the journalist and probably a dozen other people killed. What you do with that information is up to you. You can choose to stay silent like I did for 10 years. You can tell yourself that sometimes secrets need to be kept for the greater good. You can decide that exposing this truth would cause more harm than letting the lie continue. Or you can do what my colleague tried to do, what the journalist died trying to do, what I should have done 10 years ago, instead of living as a coward while families suffered. You can tell the truth regardless of the consequences, and let those 239 victims finally have their real story told. Whatever you choose, remember this: the people who did this, the people who turned a commercial flight full of innocent civilians into a disposable asset in some intelligence operation, they're still out there, they're still operating, they're still moving classified cargo on commercial flights, still gambling with civilian lives in the name of national security. And they're absolutely willing to kill anyone who threatens to expose what they're doing. MH370 won't be the last flight to disappear under mysterious circumstances, as long as governments continue to use civilian aviation as cover for military and intelligence operations. As long as the protocols for dealing with compromised cargo include the option of making an entire plane full of people vanish, this will happen again. Maybe not next year, maybe not for a decade, but it will happen again because the system that allowed it to happen the first time is still in place. I don't know how much longer I have. Could be hours, could be minutes. Could be that they've been listening to this entire recording and are already outside my door. But whatever time I have left, I'm spending it getting this information uploaded and distributed as widely as possible. There's one more thing I need to tell you. Something I discovered just last week that finally explains why they've been so desperate to keep this secret. Why they were willing to kill my colleague and the journalist and anyone else who got too close to the truth. It's not just about the classified cargo. It's about what that cargo was being used for. I managed to track down a former intelligence analyst who worked in the same department as the intelligence officer. She'd left the service years ago and was dying of cancer, which meant she had nothing left to lose. When I showed her the documentation I'd gathered, she went pale. Then she started talking. The cargo on MH370 wasn't being delivered to Beijing, it was being stolen from Beijing, or more accurately, being prevented from reaching Beijing. The diplomatic package contained prototypes of quantum encryption technology that would have given China a 10-year advantage in secure communications, technology that had been developed by a team of international scientists, some of whom were passengers on that flight. The operation was supposed to be simple: disable the transponder, escort the plane to a remote airfield, extract the cargo and the scientists, then stage a crash in the Indian Ocean with no survivors. Clean, untraceable. The kind of operation intelligence agencies have been running for decades. But something went wrong. The pilots figured out what was happening. They tried to resist, tried to deviate from the planned route. That's when the decision was made to bring the plane down rather than risk it being recovered with evidence of the operation intact. The escort aircraft didn't just guide MH370 to its final destination, they ensured it never reached any destination at all. Every piece of wreckage that's been found, every bit of debris that's washed up on distant shores over the years, it's all been carefully managed, released at strategic times to keep the search going in the wrong direction, to maintain the illusion that we're still looking, still trying to solve the mystery, when the people in charge have known exactly what happened since the moment it happened. The analyst told me something else, something that keeps me awake at night, even more than everything else I've learned. MH370 wasn't the first time they'd used this protocol, and it won't be the last. There's a list, she said, a classified document that tracks every commercial flight that's been compromised for intelligence purposes over the past 50 years. Every plane that's been shot down, diverted, or disappeared to protect operations or prevent technology transfer. The list has over 30 flights on it. 30 flights, thousands of people, decades of families destroyed by operations that officially never happened. And the protocol is still active, still being used, still turning innocent civilians into acceptable casualties in a shadow war most people don't even know exists. She gave me one more piece of information before she died. The code name for the MH370 operation, Deep Sleep Protocol. It's named after the contingency plan for what to do when a transport operation gets compromised and there's no way to extract the cargo without exposure. You put everyone involved into a permanent deep sleep. You make sure no witnesses survive. You make sure the evidence sinks so deep it'll never be recovered. And you make sure that anyone who tries to expose what really happened gets put into their own deep sleep permanently. If this is the last thing I ever do, if telling this truth is what finally gets me killed, at least it'll be for something that matters. At least those 299 victims will have their story told. At least my colleague's courage and the journalist's investigation won't have been completely in vain. At least that dying analyst's final act of conscience won't be forgotten. Remember MH370. Remember that those people didn't die because of some inexplicable accident. They died because someone decided their lives were worth less than protecting classified cargo. They died because the protocols for dealing with compromised intelligence operations include the option of making an entire plane full of people disappear. They died because we live in a world where governments are willing to lie to families for years rather than admit what really happened. And remember that it could happen again tomorrow. Every time you board a commercial flight, every time someone you love gets on a plane, you're gambling that their flight won't be carrying classified cargo. Or you're gambling that some intelligence operation won't go wrong in a way that turns everyone on that plane into acceptable losses. You're gambling that your loved ones won't become the next entry on a classified list that tracks human lives like they're just operational statistics. The Deep Sleep Protocol is still active, still authorized at the highest levels of government, still ready to be deployed the next time a transport operation gets compromised. And nobody's going to stop using it unless enough people know it exists. Unless enough people understand that these disappearances aren't mysteries, they're murder disguised as tragedy. The truth is out there now. What you do with it is up to you. But whatever you decide, remember this: silence is complicity. Every day that we allow these operations to continue, Every day that we accept the official lies about what happened to MH370, we're giving permission for it to happen again. I'm done being silent. I'm done being complicit. Whatever happens next, at least I'll face it knowing I finally told the truth. This is my testimony. This is my confession. This is everything I know about what really happened to Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 on the night of March 8th, 2014. And if I disappear tomorrow, if I end up another convenient suicide or tragic accident, at least you'll know why. Or at least you'll know what truth was dangerous enough to get me killed. The families of MH370 deserve to know their loved ones didn't die because of some inexplicable accident. They deserve to know that their fathers, mothers, sons, daughters were sacrificed for something, even if that something was ultimately just the protection of classified cargo and the maintenance of plausible deniability for intelligence operations. I know I can't give them back their loved ones. I know this information won't undo the years of grief and uncertainty they've suffered, but at least they'll know the truth. At least they'll know that what happened wasn't random, wasn't inexplicable, wasn't just bad luck. It was a choice. A deliberate decision made by people in positions of power who decided that whatever they were protecting was worth more than 239 human lives. God help us all for what we've allowed to be done in the name of national security. And God help the families who've suffered for a decade because people like me were too afraid to tell them the truth. The files are encrypted, the coordinates are there, the truth is waiting for anyone brave enough to look for it. But be warned, once you know what I know, once you've seen what I've seen, you can't unknow it, you can't unsee it, and you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, wondering if today is the day they decide you know too much. That's the price of truth in a world built on lies. That's the cost of speaking up when powerful people want you to stay silent. I've paid that price for 10 years now. It's someone else's turn to carry this burden. Good luck. Before I end this, I want to say something to everyone I hurt by living with this secret for so long. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I became someone you couldn't recognize. I'm sorry I pushed you away. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you what was destroying me from the inside. I hope someday you'll understand that I was trying to protect you, even if my silence ended up hurting you more than the truth ever could have. And to the families of the victims, I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I'm sorry I let fear silence me for 10 years while you suffered. I'm sorry I was part of the system that kept the truth from you. I hope this information, however late it comes, provides some measure of closure. I don't know if you'll find anything there after all these years. I don't know if there's any evidence left to recover. But at least you'll know where to look. At least you'll have a real answer instead of the lies you've been fed for a decade. To whoever is watching this from whatever intelligence agency is monitoring communications for mentions of MH370, I know you're there. I know you're already tracing this upload, already trying to suppress it before it can spread. I know there are probably people on their way to my location right now, but it's too late. The information is out there. Multiple copies, multiple platforms, multiple encryption keys. You can't contain it anymore. You can kill me, you probably will, but you can't kill the truth. Or not anymore. For 10 years I've been living in fear, looking over my shoulder, wondering when you'd finally decide I was too dangerous to leave alive. And I'm tired. I'm so tired of being afraid. I'm tired of carrying this guilt. I'm tired of knowing that my silence has been part of a machine that treats human lives as acceptable losses in the name of operational security. At least I'll die knowing I finally did the right thing, even if it was 10 years too late. At least I'll die knowing that my colleague's death wasn't completely in vain, that the journalist's investigation wasn't buried forever, that the truth about those 299 people is finally going to be told. Don't trust the official story about MH370. Don't trust the theories about pilot suicide or mechanical failure or terrorism. The truth is simpler and more horrifying than any of those explanations. It was an intelligence operation that went wrong. And everyone on that plane became collateral damage in a cover-up that's been maintained for a decade through surveillance, intimidation, and murder. The people responsible are never going to face justice in a court of law. They're too protected, too insulated by layers of classification and national security privilege. But at least now you know who they are and what they did. At least now the victims' stories have been told. At least now the families have some kind of answer, even if it's an answer that raises even more horrifying questions about what our governments are willing to do in the name of security. I can hear footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment, heavy boots, multiple people. They're not trying to be quiet anymore. This is it. I want you to remember something. Every single person who boards a commercial flight trusts that the systems designed to protect them will actually protect them. That if something goes wrong, people will try to help. But MH370 Thai proved that trust is a lie. When it matters, when the choice comes down to protecting people or protecting secrets, the secrets win every time. 2377T killed them. My colleague trusted that doing the right thing would matter, and they killed him too. The journalist trusted that the truth was worth pursuing, and they killed her. The analyst trusted that her deathbed confession would make a difference, and now I'm the one carrying that weight. I trusted that maybe, just maybe, if I stayed quiet long enough, if I followed orders, if I lived with the guilt, that somehow it would be enough. But it's never enough, because silence isn't neutrality. Silence is choosing the side of the oppressor. The door is opening now. I can see shadows moving in the hallway. Multiple figures, professional, efficient. They're going to make this look like something else. Suicide probably, or maybe an accident, heart attack, robbery gone wrong. They're creative. Because this video will release, the files will decrypt, the coordinates will be revealed, and maybe, just maybe, enough people will care that something will change. Maybe the families will finally get answers. Maybe the deep sleep protocol will be exposed and shut down. Maybe the next flight carrying classified cargo won't have 219 innocent people used as expendable cover. Or maybe nothing will change. Maybe the machine is too big, too powerful, too entrenched. Maybe I'm just another inconvenient witness about to be permanently silenced, and life will go on exactly as it has been. But at least I tried. At least in these final moments I can say I finally chose truth over fear. I finally chose the families over the system. I finally chose to be the person my colleague thought I could be when he gripped my shoulder in that parking lot 10 years ago. They're at the door now. I can hear them preparing to breach. To everyone watching this, don't let them bury this again. Don't let those 209 Time people disappear into the official narrative of unexplained mystery. They were murdered. Murdered by a system that values secrecy more than human life. And that system is still operating, still making the same calculations, still willing to sacrifice whoever gets in the way. The deep sleep protocol is real. It's been used 30 times in 50 years, and it will be used again unless enough people know about it to make it impossible. Be that voice. Be the one who refuses to accept the comfortable lie. For my colleague, for the journalist, for the analyst, for everyone who tried to tell this truth and was silenced. The door is free. The operation was elegant in its simplicity, at least on paper. MH370 was supposed to land at a classified airfield on a remote island in the Indian Ocean, the kind of place that doesn't appear on any civilian maps, the kind of facility that officially doesn't exist. The plane would be refueled. The scientists and the cargo would be transferred to a military transport, and MH370 would take off again with a skeleton crew, fly another 1,000 miles south, and then simply disappear into the ocean, deep enough that recovery would be impossible, remote enough that no one would ever accidentally stumble across it. The world would search the South China Sea where the transponder went dark. They'd find nothing. Eventually, the search would be called off. Wartime word. And 239 people would become another unsolved aviation mystery. Clean, untraceable, perfect. Except the pilots weren't supposed to figure it out. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah had been flying for Malaysia Airlines for 3 years. He knew his aircraft, he knew his route, and he knew when something was wrong. When the transponder failed, he didn't panic. He followed protocol. He tried to communicate with air traffic control. And when he realized his communications were being jammed, when he saw the escort aircraft taking up positions on his wings, he understood. He'd been in the military before becoming a commercial pilot. He recognized a military intercept when he saw one, and he made a choice. Instead of following the escort aircraft's directions, he started making course corrections, subtle at first, testing to see how his escorts would respond, trying to deviate just enough to take the plane somewhere unexpected without triggering an immediate response. The analysts told me they have cockpit voice recorder data that was never released to the public, data that will never be released because it would prove the plane was under external control. She said you can hear Captain Zahari on the recording, calm, professional, telling his co-pilot exactly what was happening, explaining that they were being hijacked, that the passengers were in danger, that their only chance was to resist. "We're not going where they want us to go," he said on the recording. "We're going to fight this." For 2 hours, he fought them. Every time the escort aircraft tried to guide him toward the planned intercept point, he'd make another course correction, another altitude change, buying time, trying to get the plane somewhere visible, somewhere civilian radar might pick them up, somewhere the operation could be exposed. So they kept ordering Captain Zahari to comply, kept jamming his communications, kept the escort aircraft in position, waiting for him to run out of options. But Captain Zahari had one final card to play. He turned the plane south, toward Antarctica, toward the most remote, inhospitable stretch of ocean on the planet, a place so desolate that even if the plane went down there, recovery would be virtually impossible. If he couldn't save his passengers, if he couldn't expose the operation, at least he could make damn sure the cargo and the scientists would never be recovered either. At least he could deny them their prize. The analyst said that's when the order was given, the order that sealed the fate of everyone on board. Execute deep sleep protocol, terminate the aircraft, no survivors, no recovery. The escort aircraft weren't just there to guide MH370, they were armed. Air-to-air missiles, close-range cannons, everything needed to bring down a commercial airliner if the operation was compromised. And at 8:19 a.m. UTC, somewhere over the southern Indian Ocean, approximately 1,500 miles west of Australia in waters more than 15,000 feet deep, they used them. The plane didn't crash, it was shot down. Shot down by the same governments that spent hundreds of millions of dollars pretending to search for it. Shot down by the same intelligence agencies that told grieving families they were doing everything possible to find answers. 239 people murdered, not by terrorists, not by mechanical failure, not by pilot error, murdered by their own governments to protect classified cargo and prevent technology transfer to China. And the 5 scientists who were supposed to be extracted, the ones who'd been working on quantum encryption for years, Ryans who Western intelligence had recruited and cultivated, they died too. Better to lose the technology entirely than let it reach Beijing, better to kill everyone on board than risk exposure of the operation. That's the calculation, that's the protocol, that's what deep sleep means. When an operation is compromised beyond recovery, when witnesses can't be controlled, when cargo can't be secured, you eliminate everything. You put everyone involved into a permanent sleep, and you make sure no evidence ever surfaces. The debris that's been found over the years, the flaperon that washed up on Reunion Island, the other pieces that appeared on beaches in Madagascar and Mozambique, all carefully planted. Released at strategic times to keep the search narrative alive, to maintain the illusion that the plane crashed somewhere in the southern search zone, or to prevent anyone from looking in the actual location. Because the real crash site, the place where MH370 actually went down after being shot from the sky, that location is marked in the files I've uploaded. It's 1,500 miles west of where they told everyone to search, in an area that was deliberately excluded from the official search zones, in waters so deep that even if someone went there, recovery would be nearly impossible. But at least the families will know, at least they'll have coordinates, at least they'll have the truth about where their loved ones actually are. Captain Zahari fought until the very end, fought to save his passengers, fought to expose the truth, fought to deny the people who'd hijacked his plane their ultimate objective. He's a hero. Not the disturbed pilot the media speculated about, not the suicide suspect some expert suggested. A hero who recognized what was happening and did everything in his power to resist, even knowing it would cost him his life. Or you said, all 209 people on that plane deserve to be remembered as victims of murder, not casualties of mystery. And the deep sleep protocol, the system that made this possible, the contingency plan that's been used 30 times in 50 years, it needs to be exposed, dismantled, ended before it happens again. Because it will happen again. Unless enough people know, unless enough people care, unless the cost of using civilian aircraft as disposable assets becomes too high. That's why I'm telling you this. That's why I risked everything. That's why I'm about to die. So that maybe, just maybe, Flight 370 will be the last time. The door just burst open, multiple armed personnel flooding in, professional, efficient, exactly as expected. But the upload is complete, the truth is out there, the files are distributed. You can't stop it now. Remember them. Remember MH370. Remember what your governments are willing to do, and don't let them do it again.